Hi there, welcome back. This is a video I've been thinking about creating for quite a while now. As consultants, when we step into a new organization, we often need to address a few fears. Some of these are shared openly, but typically not so much. Regardless, these become obvious fairly quickly once we start to tease out what's working and what's not. At the end of the day, it's typically not the process or technology that slows down progress, but fear. In this video, I'm going to walk through 5 of the most common fears and share thoughts on how you, as a leader or a team member or a consultant for that matter, can identify and address these fears. And I'm going to use examples, real life scenarios versus talk about theory because I think that it'll make it easier to relate to and it's just much more interesting than, again, talking theory. So let's go through these in the order in which they come up. So, fear number 1, fear of speaking up. So right out of the gate, this is the first fear that we need to address. With any team, there are those individuals who are very comfortable sharing their ideas and suggestions. And then there are those individuals who have learned or become accustomed to kind of blending into the background. I've even worked with leaders actually who are afraid to speak up, worried about how they're going to come across, especially when it comes to sharing their thoughts and ideas in front of the team and with consultants who are oftentimes assumed to have quote unquote all the answers. And this simply isn't true, by the way. More experience? Sure. All the answers? No. It's important to make it clear that we need everyone to contribute. So, one important coaching technique that we've used in the past is separate idea generation from decision making. So, we'll say things like, right now, we're not going to make any decisions, we're just going to brainstorm. And it's important to not just encourage ideas, but to respond to them positively, even if they're not all going to work. So when somebody who's typically shy provides a suggestion, it's important to spend time exploring their idea. And at the end of the day, your role as a consultant or a leader for that matter is not to have all the ideas, but to empower your team to work together and support each other, not to be the only one talking, essentially. So those working on the front lines oftentimes have some of the best ideas, and they really know what the issues are and what they need to be successful. So when people are already afraid to speak up, bringing in consultants can make them feel even more reluctant to share their ideas, which leads into our next fear, fear of consultants. This is another interesting one. So whether communicated outright or teased out during workshops, I often hear phrases like, well, that's the way we do it, or this is our way of doing things. It's unique. There's a reason why things work the way they do. Our approach works for us, even when it doesn't. So customer needs aren't consistently being met, team members aren't truly functioning as a team, and it typically comes down to one of these 3 things or a combination thereof. So fear of outsiders misunderstanding reality are all that's involved. Definitely a legitimate concern. Fear of cookie cutter solutions. So coming in with quote unquote prepackaged answers, coming in with an approach and tools and ways, concepts and principles, definitely yes. Coming up with here's the answer for you is not going to be successful. Or, and this last one is the most common, fear of being judged instead of helped. So at the end of the day, this is typically the biggest concern with consultants. And the best improvement work starts with listening, not prescribing. So start by talking through and getting the team to visualize end state, including starting off with putting themselves into the customer position. So everyone obviously has been a customer in the past. So if your laptop wasn't working or your network, you couldn't access the network or your application wasn't working, how many minutes, hours would it take, would you expect to get a response and a resolution? Also, just how the team wants to work together. So, and providing examples of and helping them visualize. So imagine providing resolutions and assistance to customers in minutes versus hours or days without having to work harder or faster. Imagining simple, clear processes and technology that supports what they're trying to do. And here's where the crux is. There's often a big gap between what customers' needs are. So as an outcome of those discussions, what the resolution time and behavior should be, and what teams believe that they can deliver. So it's important to engage the team in problem-solving exercises so they become comfortable with questioning why things currently work and how things can be improved. So getting the team excited about the future is half the battle. In many ways, fear of consultants is really a combination of all the fears that we're going to talk about here, all bundled together. So fear three, fear of accountability. So in maturing service organizations, I find there's often a blurry line when it comes to accountability. So who's truly accountable for a process or a service? Let's take service owners, for example. Ideally, one person is ultimately accountable for ensuring that a service meets customer needs from a usability and reliability standpoint. But often this accountability is shared across two or more individuals. So as a result, there's often a reluctance to shift the accountability to one person and upset whoever was sharing that accountability. Also, people fear accountability in situations where there's been some sort of blame game historically. So no one wants to be left, quote unquote, holding the bag. So on one hand, you have individuals who are chomping at the bit to be accountable and others that really would rather do anything else. So how do we go about addressing this? So as always, it's important to start off with the why. So why are we assigning accountability to one individual in the first place? And this comes down to clarity. So if accountability is shared, it often ends up meaning no one is truly accountable. Responsible, yes, having teams responsible for services, processes, practices, absolutely. But one person really needs to be ultimately accountable. But, and this is key, it's crucial to provide those who are assigned accountability with the support and backing they need to be successful. Accountability without the latitude for improving a service or practice, it's or the tools to be able to change is a recipe for frustration and failure. So provide accountable leaders with the tools, processes, and the authority to improve their service. So in doing so, we typically work with leadership to create short, simple business case templates and guidelines that accountable service leaders can use to request funds or other resources based upon well-defined business needs and simple metrics. And that's key. Keeping it simple. It doesn't need to be long, drawn out, complicated process. So empowerment should go hand in hand. When done well, establishing accountability can become a great way as well to build strong, capable future leaders. So we've covered the next two fears to some extent in other videos, and I'll include a link at the end. But I'd like to add a couple of additional thoughts. Fear number four, fear of metrics. So when leaders talk about maturity, teams are often hesitant, not excited. And you can see this in body language when you're holding workshops or meetings or in some of the responses. So the metrics are screwy, so we really can't rely on them, or we can't possibly share those metrics, not until they reflect where we want to be. So these fears, all of these fears actually are entirely rational. So most resistance to maturity isn't about the work, but it's about what might be revealed. And honestly, once a team's been burned on this or any of the other fears in the past, this concern makes sense. So there's two important points that I want to make here. One is the numbers aren't going to change until we start to look at them openly. And two, everyone pretty much already knows whether services are being delivered and supported consistently and whether the teams are really meeting customer expectations. So whether metrics feel threatening or empowering depends entirely on how they're being used and why. So especially when those metrics tell an uncomfortable story. So it's important to explain out of the gate how and why we're going to use them, and then share those visibly, share those metrics, preferably within the first couple of weeks. The sooner the better, and then demonstrate to the team during review sessions how you plan on using them. And we often help teams look at their work through the customer's eyes, as I mentioned earlier, and that perspective usually makes it obvious why the numbers matter. So once we've agreed on what good looks like, we can talk about what we might do as a team to achieve that consistency in response time. So once leaders start to use metrics to provide constructive feedback and engage the teams in problem solving, individuals tend to relax. And this typically happens fairly quickly, especially if you're obvious about it in a positive way. So not at first, perhaps. Teams are initially reluctant to be open up to this kind of brainstorming and sharing of metrics or any other information. But after they start to understand the approach, they inevitably start to formulate great ideas on their own. And some of the ideas that they come up with are going to challenge the status quo, so how the team's always worked in the past. So, for example, I worked with a service desk where an analyst had said that um, we asked the analyst, so what would it have taken so it hadn't taken hours or days to get a response and resolution? And they had mentioned that if they had been able to contact the vendor directly, they could have resolved it in minutes. Now, this was considered verboten previously, but we did some homework, created some guidelines, and made it happen. So it doesn't take long to get the team engaged again if you and excited about making change if you listen to them. But it does require patience and leaders who are willing to stay with the discomfort long enough to build trust. So, fear five, fear of agreements. So service targets are a great example of this, and we explore this in more depth in a service management in movies on A Few Good Men. So I'll just touch on it briefly here. Service agreements typically document agreements around expected behavior and target processing times. So service organizations are often reluctant to agree to a set of expectations and then document these behaviors and targets. One common example where expectations are unclear is when it comes to passing tickets between the service desk and service teams. So when a service desk is unclear about what's going to take place, once they've passed that ticket on to a service team, often analysts will continue holding on to that ticket, either physically and not pass it on, or mentally. They want to make sure that the customer's issue gets resolved and that they're the ones, because they're going to be the ones on the front line. They're going to be the ones essentially the customer are going to call back if the issue isn't resolved in a timely manner. So I've heard a few leaders express that agreements seem too dictatorial or they can't be written because each ticket or service team is unique. So how do we address this without turning agreements into a painful exercise? Similar to metrics, we start with a why. So the why needs to be made clear up front. One of the first things we do with service desks is standardize the ticket management or handling process. And once analysts start to follow a consistent process, it becomes much easier to improve efficiency. And customers start experiencing consistent service as a result. Consistency, consistency is often an important key when it comes to improving customer engagement and inter-team handoffs. When agreements are presented in a way that's to help the team succeed, they stop feeling restrictive and start to reduce stress instead of creating it. So, in closing, all these fears essentially share the same root issue. Increasing transparency without explaining the why or providing support feels threatening. It's important to listen and understand these fears and then build trust by explaining the why and providing the team and individuals with consistent support. Maturity done well should reduce stress, not increase it. And here's another important point. While support and guidance are critical, leaders still need to keep moving things forward. So if leaders shirk or shy away from driving change, individual team members and teams can unintentionally start to think that change is optional. So have patience, and before you know it, the team will start to drive change as hard or in some cases harder than you do. Thank you for watching. And so here's your takeaway for today. What kind of fears have you experienced with your team? Where's your team showing trepidation as you work to improve your service organization? Why is that? What are you doing to make sure they understand the reasoning behind the change? And what support are you providing to help them be successful? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video interesting, you might be interested in our video on leading change, managing stress, using metrics, or using agreements effectively. Have a fantastic day, and we will see you in the next video. Bye-bye now.